So I'm not that big of an REM fan, but one of their recordings is called Out of Time. And I have this one book that's a history of the band. They named the album Out of Time because they couldn't decide what to name it, and it was coming up on the deadline for them to deliver it to the label, and they looked at each other and said, okay, we're out of time, and that was just what they decided to name it. But along the way, at one point, they told a Rolling Stone columnist or a reporter for some trade paper that they were going to name it High on Drugs. And they wrote that down and reported it as just REM messing with their label, which is kind of a wonderful way to mess with your label, that it's the 1990s and you're going to name your rock album High on Drugs. I don't think parents would be too thrilled with that. We used to think, you go far enough back, and we used to think that when it came to alcoholism, that it was a moral weakness and a moral failing. And what you needed to do is you needed to teach people. And when they thought better, when they were choosing to do all of that drinking because they thought it was good and it was within their control. And if you could just show them that drinking was bad with enough force, they would ultimately quit. And not just alcoholism, really any addiction. One of my other sort of relaxation reading topics is I have a little fascination with a comedy troupe from the 1900s called the Marx Brothers. And one of them, Chico, he's the guy who talks with an Italian accent and he plays the piano. He, not on screen, but in his private life, he was addicted to gambling, and badly addicted. Within the family, they say that there is fairly compelling evidence that he was addicted to gambling going all the way back to when he was 10 years old. And so over the years, as his brothers just kept getting wealthier and wealthier, he kept pouring all his money down the drain because he played pinochle and had to bet on it all the time. He bet on the horses. He bet on pool matches. He bet on boxing matches. He always had to have something he was betting on. His wife actually insisted that they rent the house that they lived in. And when one of her sisters-in-law asked her about it, she said, I am not going to wake up some morning and find that the house that I thought was mine and that I designed and decorated and fell in love with belongs to some gangster. Now, Chico's brothers, we now know they were enabling him. They paid off his gambling debts, and they racked their brains, tried to think up a way to tie up his money so that he would save some of it and not fritter all of it away on gambling. But they discovered what a lot of people have discovered since then, that addiction is such a hyper-motivator that a reasonably intelligent adult will slip free of any constraints and go after whatever the focus of that addiction is. And when you read some of the biographies of the family, and I think I've probably read every biography of the Marx Brothers that can be found in or out of print, you find that they went through these cycles over and over again of just berating him, of telling him that this was wrong, telling him that he had to stop, trying to persuade him to not be addicted. And in 2017, I think most of us grasp trying to persuade someone not to be addicted is a little bit like trying to persuade someone not to have cancer. There are responses to addiction, but persuasion and making them see reason are not high on the list because they are completely beside the point. They don't come anywhere near to penetrating to the root of the problem. Now, before I go any further, one thing I'll say is my faith teaches me that I'm also addicted, that all of us are addicted, and all of us, therefore, need to be in recovery. And what all of us are addicted to is our sin. Our sin nature, one very helpful way to understand it is as an addiction, not something that we can necessarily be reasoned out of, but we've got something broken and dysfunctional deep within us. And unless we take some very radical steps, and unless we stop trying to manage the addiction, stop trying to domesticate it, all we're going to do is we're going to make it secret, and we are going to nurse it in ways that are destructive to ourselves and all the people around us. So where I think we are right now as far as civic life, where I think this comes into what I have been talking about in this podcast is, I think there is an epidemic of addiction to hostility. I think a whole lot of people turn to hostility whenever they can. are very, very willing to talk about who they hate, are very, very willing, very quick to think about groups of people as enemies. And I think furthermore, before I get to a point I was about to make, let me say, I first noticed that people seem to take pleasure, they seem to almost relish feeding their hostility, not individually, but in large groups as a cultural phenomenon. I first noticed it with Rush Limbaugh, so back in the very early 1990s. More recently, there have been lots and lots of examples, but a fairly pungent example from the past few years would be Coulter. And both of them, I did not understand. Why are these people this famous? Why, when I find them this distasteful, it's like the movie they made a few years ago, The Human Centipede, and you hear about it, and I just heard a description of it. I never went anywhere near watching that movie. Just hearing the description made me not just upset, but physically uncomfortable. Just a verbal description of it. And I had the same reaction to Rush Limbaugh and Coulter, just visceral. What is wrong? Why are people drawn to this? But it begins to make a little bit more sense to me that I think Rush Limbaugh and Coulter are drug dealers. They are selling some very satisfying hostility. They are fanning people's hostility, fueling it, sharpening it, allowing people to experience it more and more in more stark terms. And I will also say that the whole time, this phenomenon of orchestrated hostility, it has been in the same cognitive and affective neighborhood inside most people as the old turn to bigotry, the old turn to race prejudice, the old turn to gender prejudice. And the thing is, you come out of the civil rights era, and through the 60s and 70s and 80s, those attitudes, those opinions become deeply taboo, to where if you express any kind of opinion that is derogatory to a racial minority or to women, you risk having your career ended. It becomes a public scandal. Whatever organization you're affiliated with is forced to deal with you, and you are toppled from a position that you may have taken a lifetime trying to reach. Now, think for a second. What gives drugs their street value? It's not anything intrinsic about the substance itself or about the inconvenience involved in manufacturing it. They're not that hard to manufacture. It's the war on drugs. If there were no war on drugs, drugs would not be as profitable as they are. So when bigoted attitudes become taboo and are driven underground and become that dangerous, along come drug dealers who will deal in hostility, and they will claim that their stuff is safe. It's not cut with anything dangerous. They will, in some ways that I have to admit are ingenious, even though it's painful to me to say this, they will talk in code, and the code is acceptable in public, but only just. It's not fully acceptable. It's not respectable, but it's not so bad that anyone can act decisively, primarily because we have such a culture of free expression in this country. So it begins with Rush Limbaugh, another difficult to ignore, although I wish I could, proponent of it is Coulter, and then you arrive at Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is very, very effective in peddling this line. All his life, if anyone hits, he hits back harder. And I think he would agree, if he heard me put it in those terms, that that is a fair way to describe how he operates. If anyone hits, he hits back twice as hard. He deals in hostility. He has spent an entire lifetime sharpening up this riff, testing, experimenting, getting better and better at it. And so I get this mental picture of someone who spends a lifetime crossbreeding their opium poppies to get them to maximum potency. And then, at the very moment the wave of addiction hits its peak, that's the day they take their crop to market. And pretty soon, there they are in the White House. Now, as career paths go, it is dangerous to be a drug dealer. It is not something that parents dream that their kids will grow up and do. And it was dangerous for Donald Trump to tap into this resentment all the way through his campaign. People kept thinking, this has to be, what the latest thing he said has to be the one that's going to derail his campaign. And people were mystified. Lots and lots of people mystified that he could say things, and often things that were about race. And his whole riff about political correctness. What he was doing is he was resurrecting ideas that never went away. I think some people had a fantasy that we had outgrown certain kinds of hostility, that a new generation had been born that were accepting of difference. But the hostility never did go away, and there was the latent potential for people to turn to it. And people did turn to it, and the fact that it was taboo meant that there was pent-up frustration, pent-up desire for it that kept having to be stifled until someone came along who could offer them what they had been denied. And it was like finding a big old tank of rocket fuel. So I have to say, I am not an expert on substance abuse. I have colleagues who are. I have colleagues who teach in our counseling program, who teach entire classes on it, and they are cutting edge, up to the minute, on how substance abuse operates, how addiction operates within the mind of an addict, and what kinds of responses are optimal. I don't have any of that. I have a couple of bits and pieces, and I've talked about them in past episodes, that I work them into classes that I teach. I've talked a little bit about the work of Jaak Panksepp and what he discovered about the seeking impulse, about how there's a balance in the brain between the opioid system, and the opioid system is what mediates the feeling of satisfaction. So you've just had a big Thanksgiving dinner, and you sit back and you're in a food coma. You're swimming in opioids. But that other feeling that's a really good feeling, that other broad category of feelings, I guess I should say, that feeling of you're a small child and it's the night before Christmas and you are so excited you almost can't contain yourself. Or you are a Labrador retriever and your human is holding the tennis ball in the air about to throw it, and every muscle you've got is absolutely as tight as a stretched rubber band. And that is the dopamine system. And I remember the explanation I had heard proposed. I have not kept current as to whether this explanation has drawn a lot of support. But the idea is that how addiction operates is when the two systems get out of balance. When you continue to crave something, even though it is no longer bringing you to the point of opioid release. And the craving gets so bad that it hurts. And the craving intrudes on other things that you want to think about, and so you go back to the substance you're addicted to, really only because if you take the substance, it quiets the craving. So some people get started on these addictive substances in the first place because they're self-medicating. Because they have got a hurt that is external to the medication. They've got something going on in their life. They've been abandoned. They've been abused. They've had devastating disappointment. Maybe they've had their entire career, their entire livelihood, their childhood dream of their adult life. Maybe it's withered and nothing has come along to replace it. And so they have turned to some addictive substance. And to a large degree, I'm not talking in metaphor, because there is an epidemic of actual chemical substance abuse through a lot of the parts of the country where Trump won a lot of votes. But even apart from that, I think even apart from the actual taking of intoxicating substances, I think that hostility, finding a scapegoat, taking all of that hurt and narrating it to oneself, framing it to oneself as I have been wronged. And if I fight back against the one who wronged me, and if I defeat the one who wronged me, in the first place, that gives me some hope. And in the second place, all of this destructive feeling I have inside me, it's the venting hypothesis again. I can vent all of my frustration in turning all of this rage against the one who treated me unjustly. I think that even if we are hopeless about winning, Even if we think the win might be Pyrrhic, we still crave the fight. There's a trope that's going around that a lot of people who are politically aligned with me, they say what they see out of a lot of the Trump voters is that they want to stick it to the liberals. That they hear that motive expressed over and over again. They want to stick it to the liberals. Every time they see that a liberal is uncomfortable, that's good enough reason by itself to do what they do, even if it doesn't manage any problems, even if it doesn't make one person healthier or safer. And that, to me, sounds like taking that craving for hostility and quieting the craving for hostility, even if after you've been hostile, there is no opioid release, because you did not defeat an enemy. You did not get an obstacle out of your way. And another thing that's true about people who are caught in the throes of their addiction when it begins to take over their lives is people will rationalize and twist reality to defend their addictions and stay in denial about them. And that so explains some of the behavior that I can't see any other way. I can't explain any other way. That Donald Trump can deny that he said things even while there are clips of him saying them. That Donald Trump can complain in bitter terms, violent terms about other people's behavior, behave the exact same way, and his voters will say, we don't care and we don't see anything inconsistent about it. That kind of pattern of irrationality, and I don't mean someone disagrees with me, I mean this is irrational. It looks to me like the behavior of someone being confronted with their addiction. Because the thing is, reasoning with an addict gets you nowhere. I've talked before about motivated reasoning, about directional information goals, where people they'll filter what information reaches them, not for the purpose of trying to find out what the answer is to a question, but they'll filter it to cherry pick what is available to support how they have made up their mind to think or feel. Now, I do have to say, if you start studying what it is that people claim about addiction, how people claim addiction works, and what are supposed to be the best responses to addiction, you stumble into a realm that is really, really loaded up with a lot of junk science. I know that there's an old bit of folk wisdom that says that you just need to let an addict hit bottom. You need to let an addict's life get as bad as it possibly can. And when it gets as bad as it possibly can to where they can no longer tolerate the life they have made for themselves, then that will ignite in them a new motivation of another kind. The horror of really having been confronted with how bad it can get will rival the motivation to pursue the addiction. And I do know that, or at least I am under the impression, that is something that has largely been debunked. And I know that there are a lot of other ideas about addiction. If you go out and you try to learn what is out there about substance abuse, you're in a minefield, because it is the kind of thing where there is a lot of wealth at stake, and a lot of people are motivated to take their nostrums, their prescriptions that really are not backed by data carefully gathered, but they're tempted to dress them up in what looks like research. So part of me really wants to take a chunk of the summer, which I have coming up, and sit down and learn what is the state of the art. What do we know right now about what it is in the human brain and the human personality that makes addiction such a stubborn thing and so difficult to manage, and what conclusions can I draw, what insight can I arrive at about how, if I am right about a big kink in our civic life, about our politics being addiction to hostility, what does that tell me about what I should not expect to be productive and what I should expect to be an appropriate response? One other thing, I don't like to think about this, but I really can't deny it. There are too many cases out there. I know about some anecdotally, and I'm dimly aware of evidence that backs this claim up. There are people for whom addiction ultimately is fatal, despite our best efforts. Despite trying everything we can think of, it seems as though there never was much of a chance in the first place. One of my other bits of relaxation reading I have around my home is an oral history of Saturday Night Live, and they talk in there about both John Belushi and Chris Farley and how both of them passed away. And with John Belushi, it caught people largely by surprise because when Saturday Night Live first went on the air, there were a lot of people who were doing drugs in the offices where they were writing and preparing the program. But then, in the 1990s, when Chris Farley was in the cast, they had learned their lesson, and a whole lot of people had quit. And Chris Farley tried to quit several times. And Lorne Michaels tried to help him quit and even took him off the show, grounded him from being on the show, and sent him to rehab. And on a few occasions, people said he was looking good, he was looking healthier, he was talking about how he had kicked it, and he went straight back to it. And it's not a happy thought. But here in the United States, I think you can pick a lot of chapters in history where our addiction to hostility has once again reared its ugly head, lashed out with all its destructive potential. I really think that a big part of the problem might be that exact culture of free expression. The fact that, I mean, this could send me wandering off. Maybe this will be an episode in the future. This may be one part of the price you pay for being a civilization that is knit together out of an individualist culture. And in a collectivist culture, there may be a lot more oppression. There may be a lot more stifling, sincerely held opinions. But if the culture grows up that certain things may not be said because they are destructive to group cohesion, if that's what everyone expects, and if there is a consensus that upholds that and perpetuates it, which we don't have in the United States, then maybe at the very least they don't have to pay this kind of price. They don't have to endure this kind of problem. I don't know, maybe it's just a case of pick your poison, because I do know that large groups and not the consensus, but the majority view can sure trample some of the outliers, some of the people who don't see things the same way as mainstream opinion. It can make their lives just about unlivable, and I'm not sure that would be an improvement over what we have, where people are free to think what they like, but because they're free to think what they like and express it the way that they like, they're free to be the Rush Limbaughs, the Ann Coulters, and the Donald Trumps of the world. And under certain conditions, when political opinion is like a dry tinder forest ready for a forest fire, it just takes a few very public, shocking, and flamboyant expressions of hostility for there to be this sudden movement, this sudden energy in a voting bloc that can turn an election and can make a country look very different. So what I guess I know about what works, I've heard before that relocating, moving to where you're in a different place, around different people, sometimes just being at a remove from the source of your addiction works. I don't know what that looks like in my extended analogy to the political situation. Maybe Donald Trump decides he doesn't want to be in office, and he goes and just starts making TV shows. I wouldn't mind if that happened. But if that were to happen, I don't know that the hostility would go away. I don't know that the primed ground for people to make political power out of being hostile, I don't know that that would decrease at all. I've talked before about Paul Watzlawick and the Palo Alto group and a theory of interpersonal communication. We call it the interactional view. It is the foundation, as I understand it, for family systems theory. And one of the ideas that come out of that work is that groups of people, their web of relationships with one another, they operate as a system, and the system is homeostatic, which is to say, it will try to maintain equilibrium. The forces will balance out, and they will try very, very hard. Adjustments will happen almost automatically to stop outside threats from fundamentally changing anything. You might think in the United States about how efforts at political reform, efforts at campaign finance reform, efforts to try to limit the power, limit the influence that very powerful groups have on our elections. Our electoral system is so locked that it almost effortlessly absorbs all those reforms, co-opts them, and neutralizes them. And that's kind of the idea that Watzlawick is talking about, that people get used to how they interact with one another, and those interactions turn into habits. And people will very much resist having their system broken apart and turned into something else. So the example, whenever I teach the interactional view, is the problem is not the one person who has the addiction. So maybe you grew up with an alcoholic parent. But the problem is the combination of the behaviors of all the members of the system. And one unpleasant surprise people have had over the years is the one person with the addiction might actually quit and discover that everybody else in the household developed their own coping strategies for the addiction, and they don't particularly want to change those, and that there's still a lot of stress in those relationships because people misunderstood and thought that one addiction was the source of everything. So you might, if you are an alcoholic parent and therefore not around for your kids, you might develop very headstrong kids who manage everything themselves. And then you successfully go into recovery and you want to be more hands-on with your kids, and you discover they don't want that. Now, what this implies is that the problem is not people who are turning again and again to hostility, even hostility that doesn't solve any problems, but hostility for its own sake. The problem is not those folks. The problem is everyone. The problem is the interaction between all the blocks in the community. The problem exists all the way across the civic landscape. Everybody has developed habits for how they respond to one another. I've talked before about how there are a lot of people who have responded to Trump voters by calling them stupid, who have once again and again, made what seem to them very reasonable arguments that Trump is a bad president and Trump's decisions are bad decisions. But what you're doing there is you are reasoning with an addict. You are trying to persuade someone that someone has found that being a loyal supporter of Trump, and I've talked in other episodes about how loyalty is everything. The relationship is eclipsing the content. And when you try to persuade someone by piling up evidence, you're trying to reason with an addict. What Watzlawick said is that usually reframing has to come from an outsider. And I come back once again back to what I talked about in the first episode, Martin Luther King. Because what he did, Martin Luther King Jr. successfully reframed a system, but he didn't do it overnight. He didn't even do it in a single election cycle. What he did through his campaign for civil rights was to drag the problem out in the open, keep showing up, keep marching, keep speaking. Don't let the working out of this addiction be quiet. Don't let the addict go off to a private place and get a fix. But don't enable either. Don't add to the hostility, the non-violent part, the part about soul force and about love, the way he defined it, was a way of refusing to join the hostility, refusing to fight back. And as I've talked about before, any time you join the fight, you play right into the hands of the people who are at the top of this and perpetuating it. What you want to do is you want to find a way to opt out. You want to find a way not to contribute to another cycle of the escalation and the ratcheting up of hostility. So this is not a particularly cheerful or pleasant thought for me to work out, but I really think I'm on to something. I mean, I already see the world in interlocking analogies, but this one analogy seems to capture and explain so many things effectively that I think I may have arrived at the bedrock of where I'm going to wind up in my read on politics and its dysfunctions.